With the Star Wars Battlefront 2 beta finally coming to a close, we got our most in-depth look at this latest installment yet, across console platforms. PS4 and Xbox One in this case, and we've already sampled the PlayStation 4 Pro build in an earlier demo of sorts. And the results are quite interesting all round. But before we talk about the individual platform specifics, let's discuss the game first. Battlefront 2 isn't just an extension of the original game. We're not just looking at new maps, characters and weapons here, but rather a substantial overhaul in a number of areas, from the core gameplay to the visuals themselves. On a technical level, the difference really stands out. Battlefront 2 continues to use DICE's in-house Frostbite engine, and the game appears to have built upon some of the enhancements found in Battlefield 1, adding to a more complex, refined presentation all round. For a start, the maps themselves are considerably more detailed than the original Battlefront. Take the beautiful city streets of Naboo, complete with complex geometry details and intricate modelling of all the surrounding buildings. It's really quite impressive. And then there's the gorgeous interiors with the beautiful marble flooring, which really showcases DICE's use of physically based rendering and a technique called photogrammetry, where various materials used in the films are scanned in order to provide realistic surfaces, and it works a treat. The game looks and feels like Star Wars throughout. And this is also evident on the map taken from The Force Awakens, set on planet Takodana. In this strike mission, we're looking at lush forests surrounding Maz's castle, and the results are one of the most complex maps we've seen in a Battlefront game. Particle physics are in play, along with lush foliage and plenty of intricate detail. It's a nice step up over the original Battlefront, and that's combined with a huge boost in post-processing, lighting effects, and more. The takeaway here is that Battlefront 2 is a major step up from the original, and that's just the multiplayer. I can't wait to see what other goodness the campaign brings. And what I find fascinating is that DICE has not only improved the graphics across the board, but have also delivered upgrades to the base consoles as well, particularly with regards to image quality. The original Star Wars Battlefront operated with a fixed resolution on both PS4 and Xbox One, 900p on PS4, 720p on Microsoft's platform, which meant that image quality stood out between the two. But in Battlefront 2, we're looking at a dynamic frame buffer instead. So for PlayStation 4, that means we can get anything from roughly 972p all the way up to a native 1080p. And that means that image quality generally feels improved over the original. It's certainly cleaner and a little bit sharper in places. The game actually spends a lot of time above 1000p, with much of the Naboo battle taking place at 1080p, only dropping down to 972p in more demanding scenes where there's heavy draw distances at play along with alpha and particle effects. But even then, the use of temporal anti-aliasing and post-processing means the differences don't always stand out. And the use of dynamic resolution isn't always aggressive. There can be subtle steps between resolution changes. Perhaps the biggest improvement though is on Xbox One, where the original ran at 720p, Battlefront 2 instead starts off at 900p. But from what I can see, it can actually go up to about 1000p. The result is that we do get a slightly more refined presentation than in the original Battlefront. In fact, sometimes it's noticeably cleaner and clearer too. Although the presentation doesn't maintain that level of image quality as consistently as on PS4, drops down to 792p are certainly visible with an additional level of softness in demanding moments, and of course the game does spend a reasonable amount of time in the 800s as well. So it's a softer presentation than PS4, but definitely an improvement over the original Star Wars Battlefront. And really it's a combination of both the dynamic frame buffer but also the use of temporal anti-aliasing, which provides a very smooth look to edges. The game might appear a little soft at times, but it avoids those sort of harsh jaggies that could sometimes be visible, particularly on Xbox One version of the original Battlefront. And then there's obviously the huge amount of post-processing going on, film grain, chromatic aberration and lens distortion effects, which can produce a soft focused image to the game even when we're looking at full native 1080p for example on the PlayStation 4. It's perhaps the only area of the game that I'm maybe not too keen on. I mean, I don't mind the film grain, that makes sense after all. It creates a lovely filmic presentation similar to the Star Wars movie, shot on 35mm film. But the chromatic aberration and lens distortion is laid on a little bit thick. and that's something that would be nice to be resolved in the final release. And indeed, the lighting lead working on the game at DICE has confirmed via a tweet that cinematic effects such as the lens distortion, film grain and chromatic aberration will be toned down in the full game, so we'll look forward to seeing the new balance they achieve with that. But for now, aside from that, I think that the presentation is looking very good, and it actually holds up extremely well across PS4 and Xbox One. There are some variances in visual quality, but these are often quite subtle and don't really appear all that pronounced. Take shadow quality. These appear smooth on both platforms and just a touch softer on Xbox One, but really it's not something that obviously stood out to me while I was running around shooting people. Reflections also appear to be rendered at a lower resolution on Xbox One, visible by slightly extra blockiness or pixelation when exploring the interiors of the palace on Naboo. Aside from that, other differences come down to streaming, which could simply be down to the variances in the hard drives used in the machine, even if they're running at the same speed. In this case, PS4 gets a head start when loading in assets at the beginning and end of a match, which means we look at high quality textures a few seconds before Xbox One. But overall, I think the two are very close here, and compared to the original Battlefront, the gap is definitely smaller, and I get the feeling that the biggest difference between the two is certainly in terms of the dynamic resolution rather than the effects being tweaked elsewhere. And that is to say, the game generally does look great on both platforms. Base PS4 and Xbox One also appear reasonably comparable to the game running on PS4 Pro as well. Obviously, resolution on Pro is higher, a maximum of 1440p, but usually metrics fall below that, somewhere in the region of around 1296p. Not a massive jump over 1080, but enough to provide an extra level of refinement when viewed on a 4K screen. Of course, here we're looking at that extra pixel count downsampled to 1080p, and that means that image quality is just more consistent on Pro when playing on a standard Full HD TV. In terms of upgrades in other areas, well, we don't have a lot of comparison points here, but from what we can tell, it seems like ambient occlusion is dialed up a notch on PS4 Pro over base PS4, and alongside that we also look to get tessellation as well, with slightly smoother geometric details across the forest in Takadana. Stronger use of light shafts are also in play, and we also noticed extra debris dotted around across the ground. These aren't radical upgrades, but they do add an extra level of refinement and detail on Pro, and there's the potential for more in other areas too. But again, we've only had a limited amount of comparison points with this beta, so we'll be taking a more thorough look at the game when the final release hits. So, Star Wars Battlefront 2 is shaping up to be a big upgrade over the original game. Expanded gameplay mechanics along with enhanced visuals, bigger, more detailed environments, physics-based particles, and well more. It's certainly delivering a more epic cinematic Star Wars experience that we've seen before. It's a big step up over the original then, but how does this affect performance? Well, one of the interesting things is that while we've got a boost to image quality across base PS4 and Xbox One, right now in the recent beta, performance was actually less stable than in the original. Of course, 60 frames per second is the target here, but in terms of hitting it on a consistent basis, neither platform deliver the same kind of smooth, consistent gameplay experience that the original did, at least at the moment. Let's start with PlayStation 4 here. The original Star Wars Battlefront maintained a pretty much lock solid 60 FPS on Sony's system. There was the occasional rare drop, but outside of that we were looking at an excellent level of performance throughout. In the recent beta for Battlefront 2 though, performance doesn't quite hit that lofty standard. But ultimately it really depends on what mode you play, and the more demanding modes with the most players on screen, around 40 players in the Galactic Assault mode, that hits performance a lot harder than say Strike, which features less than half that. Generally in some of the less demanding modes we're looking at 60 frames per second for quite a bit of the time, with only smaller drops impacting on the action. 2-3 FPS maybe, sometimes a touch more, but overall there's a sense that the game plays very smoothly and the drops in performance here don't really impact on the action too much. This is true whether we're playing in arcade mode running around the Palace of Naboo with Darth Maul, or even in the outdoor forests of Takodana, in the strike mode, where we're using various weapons such as a sniper pistol in order to hit enemies from a distance. There's of course the sense that the level of consistency isn't as solid as the original Battlefront, but at the same time the game does make a pretty good fist at hitting 60 frames per second. Where performance doesn't hold up quite so well is in the Galactic Assault mode. Frame rates here are hit much harder, and there are a number of reasons for this. For a start, the environments themselves are pretty open with plenty of detail, and that extra level of draw distance tends to hit the GPU quite hard, particularly in demanding scenes where there's a lot of alpha effects in play. Bandwidth kind of gets stretched here. The other of course is the sheer number of players on screen, a maximum of 40 in this mode. And this is a more of a CPU heavy mode compared to Strike or Arcade, and as a result there's perhaps an indication that frame rates are being hit harder because the CPU is under more of a workload here, rather than the GPU. On Xbox One we see a similar set of results. The Galactic Assault tends to hit performance quite hard due to the high player count and expansive scenery with plenty of detail, whereas when we move into modes such as Strike or Arcade, performance tends to hit that desired 60 FPS target more solidly. In these kinds of situations, there's a sense that the Xbox One version isn't quite as smooth as on PS4. Performance tends to get hit harder on Microsoft's console, leading to a bit more judder and interruptions in smoothness in the general action. It's certainly something that will be noticeable during gameplay, especially on modes such as Strike and Arcade, where even though performance is better than the Galactic Assault mode, it's still not quite as smooth as on PS4, and there tends to be larger drops in frame rate. Of course, it's worth bearing in mind that this is a beta test, and in the past we've seen DICE perform some great optimizations when moving from early to finished code with the original Battlefront. And this means that there's a good chance we could be seeing considerable improvements in performance. Perhaps absolutely locked 60 FPS may be off the cards in the massive Galactic Assault modes, but in terms of say Strike or the Arcade mode, then there's a potential to get frame rates locked down a lot more solidly there. We have to remember that Battlefront 2 is considerably more demanding than in the original. It's a more complex game with a lot more going on, but at the same time DICE have a proven track record of optimizing the experience to get better performance when moving into final code, and really I'm looking forward to seeing just how well that pans out. So far Battlefront 2 is shaping up to be a great sequel to the original in terms of the multiplayer content alone, expanding upon both the gameplay and the graphics to provide what is probably the most comprehensive Star Wars experience we've seen so far. And yeah, this is just the multiplayer we're looking at. I'm really excited to check out the actual main campaign, which looks to provide a whole new twist on the Star Wars concept, playing as an Imperial soldier rather than a member of the Rebel Alliance, which could prove interesting. And of course there's the sense that the technology in the campaign could be used to provide even more impressive bombastic set pieces, along with upping the level of detail. But yeah, anyway, I think that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Battlefront 2 beta, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also make sure you check out our Patreon page at digitalfoundry.net, where you can download the high quality source file, allowing you to see the game running at 60 FPS in all its intended glory. As ever, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.